Sophie Chen wiped the flour from her hands and glanced at the clock for the third time in 10 minutes. 6:30 in the morning, and her phone buzzed with the message she'd been dreading. Mrs. Patel, her neighbor and Emma's regular babysitter, was down with the flu and couldn't take Emma today. She leaned against the kitchen counter of her small bakery cafe, watching the croissants turn golden through the oven window. The morning bloom had been her mother's dream, passed down to Sophie 3 years ago when cancer took her too soon. Then 6 months later, a car accident took her husband, James. At 28, Sophie found herself a widow with a toddler and a business she could barely keep afloat. Mama. Emma's small voice drifted from the apartment upstairs. Sophie had hoped to let her sleep another hour, but that plan was crumbling like the pastries she'd burned last Tuesday. "Coming, sweet pea," Sophie called, untying her apron. She climbed the narrow stairs connecting their living space to the cafe below, her mind already spinning through impossible logistics. It was Thursday, one of their busiest mornings. The breakfast crowd would start arriving in less than an hour, followed by the mid-morning coffee rush. Emma sat on her bed, still in her pajamas decorated with tiny strawberries, clutching Mr. Hoppy, her beloved stuffed bunny. Her dark hair stuck up in all directions, and her brown eyes, so much like her father's, looked worried. "Is Mrs. Patel okay?" Emma asked. At 5 years old, she was remarkably perceptive, often sensing Sophie's stress before words were spoken. "She has a cold, baby. She needs to rest." Sophie sat beside her daughter and smoothed down her hair. "So today, you get to come to the cafe with Mama. Would you like that?" Emma's face brightened, though Sophie noticed the slight hesitation. Her daughter loved the cafe but understood it meant Mama would be busy. "Can I bring my coloring books?" "Absolutely. And Mr. Hoppy too." Sophie kissed her forehead. "But you need to promise me something. Stay in the back corner booth where I can see you, okay? The cafe gets very crowded, and I need to know you're safe." "I promise, Mama." 30 minutes later, Sophie had Emma settled with crayons, coloring books, and a plate of banana pancakes. The breakfast crowd began trickling in, regulars who knew their orders by heart. Mr. Chen, no relation, wanted his black coffee and everything bagel. The Johnson twins ordered matching lattes and shared a cinnamon roll. Grace, Sophie's best friend since high school, arrived in her nursing scrubs, exhausted from a night shift. "Is that my favorite tiny human?" Grace slid into the booth beside Emma, earning a giggle. "Auntie Grace. Look, I colored a butterfly." "That's beautiful, sweetheart." Grace looked up at Sophie with concern. "Mrs. Patel." "Flu," Sophie confirmed, balancing 3 plates on her arm with practiced ease. "I'll manage." But managing proved harder than expected. The morning rush intensified. The espresso machine made concerning noises. A delivery arrived 30 minutes early. And Emma, bless her patient heart, stayed quietly in her corner, coloring picture after picture, asking for nothing. By 11 o'clock, Sophie's feet ached, her hair had escaped its bun, and she'd forgotten to eat breakfast herself. The lunch crowd would arrive soon. She glanced at Emma, who'd abandoned her coloring and was watching the cafe with curious eyes, taking in every detail of this world where her mother worked so hard. Sophie didn't know it yet, but in exactly 47 minutes, everything would change. A regular customer would walk through that door, as he did every Thursday at 11:47 precisely. And her daughter, lonely for a father she barely remembered, would see something in him that would crack open the carefully protected walls around both their hearts. The lunch rush hit like a wave at 11:30. Sophie moved between tables with mechanical precision, her smile automatic even as exhaustion pulled at her bones. Emma had been so good all morning, switching from coloring to quietly playing with Mr. Hoppy, making up little stories only she could hear. At exactly 11:47, Sophie noticed because she'd just glanced at the clock, the door chimed. Daniel Morrison walked in, as he did every Thursday, dressed in his usual dark blazer and carrying a leather portfolio. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, tall with tired eyes that rarely met anyone's directly. In the 2 years he'd been coming to the Morning Bloom, he'd never varied his routine. Corner table by the window, grilled chicken sandwich with no tomatoes, black coffee, exactly 1 hour, minimal conversation. The other staff at the cafe, back when Sophie could afford other staff, used to speculate about him. Lawyer. Professor. Someone important. Definitely. Someone successful but profoundly alone. Sophie simply knew him as a good tipper who never complained and always said please and thank you in a voice that sounded rusty from disuse. "Your usual table's ready, Mr. Morrison," Sophie called over her shoulder, balancing 4 plates of sandwiches for a nearby family. He nodded and moved toward his corner, settling into the chair that faced the window. Sophie noticed him pull out what looked like architectural drawings, so that mystery was solved. She made a mental note to bring his coffee first, then got pulled into a small crisis when the family's youngest child spilled an entire glass of juice. Emma, meanwhile, had climbed out of her booth. She'd been sitting for nearly 5 hours, and her 5-year-old energy needed an outlet. Sophie had told her to stay put, but Emma had spotted something that made her forget her promise entirely. The man sitting alone by the window had sad eyes. Emma knew about sad eyes. She saw them every night when Mama didn't know Emma was watching, when Mama looked at the photo of Daddy on the nightstand. This man's sadness felt familiar, like an old friend she recognized but couldn't name. And he was sitting in Daddy's spot. Emma's memories of her father were fragmented, more feeling than image. But she remembered Sunday mornings at this cafe when it was Grandma's, sitting in that exact corner, Daddy reading her stories while Mama and Grandma baked. The light came through the window the same way. The view of the street was identical. Before rational thought could intervene, Emma walked straight to Daniel's table, Mr. Hoppy dangling from one hand. Daniel was reviewing the plans for a community center renovation when he sensed a presence. He looked up to find a small girl with tangled dark hair and enormous brown eyes staring at him with an intensity that was somewhat unnerving. "Hello," he said carefully. Children made him uncomfortable, not because he disliked them, but because they reminded him of everything he'd lost. His wife, Sarah, had been 4 months pregnant when the accident happened 6 years ago. Sometimes he dreamed about who that child would have been. Emma tilted her head, studying him with the unfiltered directness only children possess. "You're sitting in my papa's spot." Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize this table was." "Papa!" Emma suddenly exclaimed, her face breaking into a delighted smile. She climbed onto the chair across from him as if she'd been invited. "Mama said you were away, but you came back." The cafe didn't exactly freeze. Life isn't a movie, but several conversations faltered. Heads turned. Tom, the retired postal worker who knew everyone's business, nearly choked on his coffee. Daniel sat completely still, his mind scrambling to process what was happening. The little girl was looking at him with such pure joy that his heart physically hurt. Sophie appeared, her face drained of color. "Emma! Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. Emma, come here right now." "But Mama, it's Papa. He came back." Emma's voice carried the absolute conviction of childhood imagination. "Sweetie, no, this is..." Sophie's voice cracked. She reached for Emma's hand, mortification burning her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she repeated to Daniel. "She doesn't. Her father passed away, and sometimes I'm so sorry." Daniel watched Sophie's face cycle through embarrassment, grief, and exhaustion. He saw the circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly, the protective fierce love in how she held her daughter. And he saw Emma's confusion as her fantasy collapsed, tears beginning to well in her eyes. Something shifted in his chest, a wall he'd maintained for 6 years developing its first crack. "It's all right," Daniel heard himself say. His voice came out gentler than he'd used in years. "She's not bothering me." Sophie stared at him. "But she..." "Really? It's fine." He looked at Emma, whose tears had paused in confusion. "I'm Daniel. What's your name?" "Emma," she whispered. "And this is Mr. Hoppy. It's nice to meet you both." Daniel surprised himself by meaning it. "I'm not your papa, Emma. But I understand why you might wish I was." The wisdom in that simple statement made Sophie's eyes sting. This reserved man who barely spoke had just validated her daughter's loneliness instead of dismissing it. "I miss my papa," Emma said quietly. "Do you miss anyone?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, pierced straight through Daniel's armor. "Yes," he admitted. I do. Very much. Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then we can be sad together. Mama says being sad with friends is better than being sad alone. Sophie finally found her voice. Emma, Mr. Morrison is trying to eat lunch. We need to let him. Actually, Daniel interrupted, shocking himself, would you two like to join me? If you're not too busy. Friday morning arrived with unexpected spring rain, the kind that made the Morning Bloom's windows fog up and turn the cafe into a cozy refuge. Sophie had barely slept, replaying yesterday's bizarre encounter. After Emma's declaration, they'd spent 15 awkward but somehow pleasant minutes at Daniel's table before the lunch rush forced Sophie back to work. Emma had chatted about her coloring books while Daniel listened with careful attention, and Sophie had felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, possibility. But possibility was dangerous. Possibility meant hope, and hope meant the risk of more loss. By 3 a.m., Sophie had convinced herself that Daniel Morrison was just being polite and would probably find a new cafe for his Thursday routine. She was wrong. At 9:15, the morning rush tapering off, the door chimed. Daniel walked in, not in his usual Thursday blazer but wearing jeans and a navy sweater that made him look younger, less untouchable. He carried a wrapped package under his arm. Sophie's hands stilled over the espresso machine. Mr. Morrison. It's Friday. Daniel, he corrected, approaching the counter with visible nervousness. And I know. I wanted to bring something for Emma. Is she here? She's at kindergarten. Sophie wiped her hands on her apron, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. You didn't have to. I know. But I wanted to. He set the package on the counter. It's a book. About architecture and buildings. I thought she might like it. The illustrations are beautiful, and there are fold-out pages showing how different structures are made. Sophie stared at the package, then at Daniel, trying to reconcile this thoughtful gesture with the silent man who'd been coming here for 2 years. That's incredibly kind. But Daniel, about yesterday, my daughter, she doesn't understand boundaries yet. I don't want you to feel obligated. I don't. He met her eyes directly for the first time she could remember. I've been coming here for 2 years, Sophie. Did you know that? The use of her first name startled her. Yes. In 2 years, no one has asked me why I'm always alone. Or if I miss anyone. Your daughter asked both questions in under 5 minutes. His smile was sad. Children have a way of seeing what adults work hard to hide. Grace appeared from the kitchen, stopping short when she saw Daniel at the counter. She'd heard all about yesterday's incident. Oh, hi there. This is my friend Grace, Sophie said. Grace, this is Daniel Morrison. The architect, Grace said, her nurse's assessment sweeping over him. The one Emma adopted yesterday. Daniel's lips twitched. I suppose that's accurate. Coffee. Sophie offered, needing something to do with her hands. Please. Black. And. He hesitated. Do you have time to sit? Just for a few minutes. Sophie glanced around the cafe. Only 3 tables occupied, all regulars contentedly reading or working on laptops. Grace made a shooing motion. Go. I've got the counter. They sat at a booth by the window, not Daniel's usual corner, Sophie noticed. Neutral territory. I need to explain something, Daniel began, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. 6 years ago, I lost my wife. Sarah. We'd been married for 3 years. She was 4 months pregnant. Sophie's breath caught. Daniel, you don't have to. Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. They were both gone instantly. His voice was steady but hollow, the words worn smooth from internal repetition. Everyone said time would heal it. That I'd move forward eventually. But I didn't. I just stopped. Went through motions. Work, home, occasional meals out. Empty routines. I understand that, Sophie said quietly. My husband died in a car accident too. 2.5 years ago. Emma had just turned 3. Their eyes met in mutual recognition, the specific understanding of those who've survived similar losses. When Emma called me Papa yesterday, Daniel continued, my first instinct was panic. But then I saw her face, that pure hope, and something cracked open inside me. I've spent 6 years avoiding anything that reminds me of what I lost. Children especially. But Emma didn't see a broken man. She just saw someone sad who might understand her sadness. She has a gift for that, Sophie said, her throat tight. Sometimes I think she's wiser than both of us combined. After you two left, I sat there for another hour. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone looked at me with anything other than pity or professional courtesy. Emma looked at me with hope. As if I might be someone worth knowing. Sophie reached across the table, surprising herself, and touched his hand briefly. You are worth knowing, Daniel. He looked at their hands, and when Sophie started to pull away, he gently caught her fingers. I'd like to try something. If you're willing. What? Friendship. Real friendship. Not just silent Thursday lunches. I'd like to get to know you and Emma. And I'd like you to know me. No expectations. No pressure. Just connection. Sophie's practical side screamed warnings. He's a customer. You barely know him. Emma will get attached. You'll get hurt again. But another part of her, the part that Emma's wisdom had kept alive, whispered yes. Emma gets out of kindergarten at 2:30, she heard herself say. If you want to give her that book yourself, you could come by then. She'd love that. Daniel's smile transformed his face. I'd like that very much. That afternoon, when Emma ran into the cafe and saw Daniel waiting with the wrapped book, her squeal of delight made every head turn. She threw her arms around his legs without hesitation, and Daniel, after a moment of frozen surprise, gently patted her back. You came back, Emma announced. I did. And I brought you something. As Emma tore open the wrapping paper, gasping over each illustration of bridges and towers and houses from around the world, Sophie watched Daniel's face soften into something almost like peace. Grace sidled up beside her, whispering, That man is falling in love with your daughter. He's just being kind, Sophie protested weakly. Ma'am. And you're just looking at him like he hung the moon for purely platonic reasons. Sophie elbowed her friend but couldn't quite deny it. 3 weeks passed in a blur of coffee-scented mornings and unexpected laughter. Daniel became a fixture at the Morning Bloom, showing up not just on Thursdays but throughout the week. He'd sit with Emma after kindergarten, helping her with simple math using sugar packets or drawing buildings together on napkins. He fixed the temperamental espresso machine, patched a leak in the storage room ceiling, and once stayed until closing to help Sophie reorganize the supply closet. The small town of Riverside noticed a Mrs. Chen, no relation to Sophie, mentioned over her bagel that it was nice to see Sophie smiling again. The Johnson twins started asking pointed questions about that handsome architect. And Tom, the retired postal worker, appointed himself unofficial town gossip and Emma's self-proclaimed protector. I don't know about this Morrison fellow, Tom announced one Tuesday morning, loud enough for half the cafe to hear. Comes in here, sweeps in all friendly-like. What do we really know about him? Sophie felt her cheeks burn as several customers looked up with interest. Daniel was at his usual table with Emma, teaching her about different types of bridges using toothpicks and marshmallows. Tom, Sophie said quietly, refilling his coffee, Daniel is a friend. That's all. That's what they all say until, Tom lowered his voice conspiratorially, until you get your heart broken again, sweetheart. I'm just saying, be careful. Men like that, with money and fancy jobs, they don't usually stick around in towns like ours. The words hit harder than Sophie expected because they echoed her own 3 a.m. fears. Daniel lived in the city, 40 minutes away. He drove a car that cost more than her annual income. His world was architectural firm dinners and client presentations, while hers was burnt pastries and leaking roofs. What future could possibly exist between them? That afternoon, after Emma had gone upstairs for her bath, Daniel lingered at the counter while Sophie cleaned the espresso machine. Tom thinks you're too good for me, Sophie said, trying for lightness and landing somewhere near bitter. Daniel looked up sharply. What? Or I'm not good enough for you. Same conclusion, different angle. She scrubbed harder than necessary at a stubborn coffee stain. He's not wrong. We're from different worlds, Daniel. Sophie, you live in the city. You design buildings for important clients. I run a small cafe that barely breaks even most months. Emma and I live in a tiny apartment above this place. We're not. She gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. Daniel was silent for a long moment. When Sophie finally looked at him, his expression was unreadable. My wife and I met at a coffee shop, he said quietly. She was a kindergarten teacher, made less than $30,000 a year and loved every minute of it. When she got pregnant, we had this fantasy about the life we'd build together. Nothing fancy. Just full. Real. Sophie's hands stilled on the espresso machine. After she died, I threw myself into work. Made partner at my firm. Designed buildings that won awards. Made more money than Sarah and I ever dreamed about. And every single day felt empty. He met her eyes. These past 3 weeks, sitting in this cafe, eating your burnt scones, hey! Sophie protested weakly. Teaching Emma about architecture, talking to you about everything and nothing, fixing your espresso machine. I've felt more alive than I have in 6 years. So please don't tell me we're from different worlds when you and Emma have become my whole world. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. Daniel, I'm scared, she whispered. Emma is already so attached to you. If this doesn't work, if you realize this isn't what you want, what if it is what I want? What if this is exactly what I've been missing without knowing it? Before Sophie could respond, footsteps thundered down the stairs. Emma appeared in her pajamas, hair damp, Mr. Hoppy tucked under her arm. Mama, I forgot to show Daniel my drawing from school. She skidded to a stop, looking between them. Why do you both look sad? We're not sad, sweet pea, Sophie managed. Emma studied them with that unnerving perceptiveness. You look like you do when you think about Papa. The missing someone kind of sad. Daniel crouched down to Emma's level. Can I tell you something, Emma? She nodded seriously. I was sad for a very long time. So sad I forgot how to be happy. But then I met you and your mama, and you reminded me that being sad doesn't mean staying sad forever. Sometimes new people come into your life and help you remember how to smile. Like sunshine after rain. Emma announced, clearly pleased with her metaphor. Exactly like that. Daniel's voice was thick. Your mama is worried that I might leave and make you sad. But I need you to know something important. I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you want me to. Emma looked at Sophie with confusion. Why would we want that? See. Daniel stood, his eyes never leaving Sophie's face. The kid gets it. The next Sunday, the Morning Bloom hosted its monthly community breakfast, a tradition Sophie's mother had started where locals could come for free coffee and pastries, no questions asked. The cafe was packed with familiar faces, elderly Mrs. Patel, recovered from her flu, the Rodriguez family with their 4 boisterous children, teenagers from the high school, Grace with her nursing colleagues. Daniel had offered to help, arriving at 6 a.m. to assist with prep. Sophie found him in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, competently slicing fruit alongside Grace, who was interrogating him with the subtlety of a prosecutor. So your intentions toward my best friend are? Grace asked, wielding a knife for emphasis. Honorable, Daniel said without hesitation. Serious. Terrifying. Grace's expression softened. Good answer. The breakfast was chaotic and perfect. Emma helped distribute napkins, taking her job with adorable seriousness. Tom cornered Daniel by the coffee station, and Sophie watched nervously until she saw Tom clap Daniel on the shoulder and laugh at something he said. Then Mrs. Rodriguez's youngest, Miguel, started crying because he'd dropped his pastry. Before Sophie could intervene, Daniel had scooped up the child, retrieved a fresh croissant, and was making exaggerated silly faces until Miguel giggled through his tears. Sophie felt her last wall crumble. This man, who'd been so alone, so careful, was letting himself be absorbed into the messy, beautiful chaos of community. A family. As the morning wound down, Emma tugged Daniel toward the small stage area where Sophie's mother used to host open MIC nights. "Mama, can we do the song?" Sophie shook her head, confused. "What song, baby?" "The one Grandma taught me. About people who make your heart full." Emma was already pulling Daniel onto the stage. "Daniel knows it too. I taught him yesterday." Before Sophie could protest, Emma began singing in her clear, unself-conscious 5-year-old voice. It was a simple song about gratitude, about thanking the people who bring light into darkness. Daniel joined in on the second verse, his baritone rough but sincere. The cafe fell quiet, everyone watching this unlikely pair, the small girl and the formerly solitary man, creating something beautiful together. When Emma reached the final line, she pointed at Sophie. "Thank you, Mama and Daniel, for making my heart so full it might burst." The cafe erupted in applause. Sophie found tears streaming down her face. Grace wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "That man loves you both," Grace whispered. "I know," Sophie whispered back, finally admitting the truth. "I think I love him too." Station Governor Yorel was a tall woman with the look of someone who had been making difficult decisions for a long time and had developed, in response, a patience that was almost geological. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Cole spoke first, what he had seen on the bridge, what he had read in the Meridian filings, what Sarah had said at his door. Zara spoke second, her brother, the collective, 15 years of silence in a city that had never bothered to look at her properly. Danny spoke last, and she brought the documents, printed and also transmitted to the governor's office terminal in a format that was very difficult to ignore or misplace. Voss was in the building. He had been escorted there by station security after Governor Yorel had received Danny's transmission at 6 in the morning and had, in her geological patience, sent a very polite and very firm summons. Cole watched Voss sitting across the conference table from the governor with the particular quality of a man who is extremely accustomed to the world arranging itself around his preferences and is currently encountering the alarming experience of it failing to do so. "The Coalition Research Clause requires consent," Yorel said, for the third time, in the tone of someone who does not mind saying a thing 3 times if it needs to be said 3 times. "Consent, Mr. Voss. From the individual. This has been the law for 40 years. The individual's ability poses a potential public safety." The individual, Yorel said, held an 800-kilogram vehicle over a 60-floor drop to save a citizen's life. "The Coalition Research Clause does not apply to heroism." Agent Sarah, to Cole's genuine surprise, spoke from her place behind Voss's chair. "The specimen catalogue," she said, to Voss, not to the room. "The one from the old collective. It needs to be disclosed." Voss turned to look at her. "Sarah," he said, in a low voice. "I have worked for this company for 9 years, Sarah said, in the tone of someone who has been deciding something for a while and has just finished deciding it. "I have looked the other way for a lot of things because I told myself the research was beneficial and the methods were." She stopped. "The methods were not acceptable. The catalogue needs to be disclosed." Yorel looked at her. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" "Yes," Sarah said, and she said it the way Zara had said the word determination, like someone whose color had changed. What followed took most of the day. It was not dramatic, in the way that the bridge had been dramatic. It was paperwork and testimony and the particular grinding machinery of institutional accountability doing the thing it does when enough people refuse to look away. Voss was detained pending a coalition investigation. Meridian's research facility was flagged for a full audit. Danny's documents were formally entered into the record. The Velian Council, contacted via long-range hologram, dispatched a representative within the hour. They were not surprised by any of it, which suggested to Cole that the Velian Council had been waiting, for a very long time, for someone to finally make enough noise. Zara's brother Sol was found on Platform 2 at 4 in the afternoon. He was alive. He was not well. 15 years in a research facility had left marks that would take time to understand and more time to heal. But he was alive, and when Zara was brought to the room where he was sitting wrapped in a blanket looking at nothing in particular, he looked up and his skin went immediately to that deep warm amber that meant the thing that did not need translation. Cole stood in the corridor outside and let them have that moment, because some things are not for an audience. Danny stood beside him and said nothing, which for Danny was its own kind of eloquence. Later, much later, when the documentation was done and Sol had been transferred to Avelian Medical Center and Myra had been returned safely from her long decoy morning at the market stall with a story she was already clearly planning to tell for years, Cole and Zara were on the roof of Sublevel 9. It was not a beautiful roof by any conventional measure. It was a maintenance platform with a railing on 3 sides and a ventilation unit that hummed. But from it you could see the upper platforms lit against the dark and the stars beyond them and, on a clear night, the faint smear of light that was the neighboring system. That one, Zara said, pointing to a specific cluster, is Vel Star. You can only see it from the lower district. The upper platform light pollution blocks it. Cole looked at the cluster. You've been here long enough to know that, he said. 3 years, she said. I watched it every night. It was the one thing I had that was entirely mine, she paused. I have more now. Cole didn't say anything. He had learned, in the weeks since the bridge, that Zara valued the space around words as much as the words themselves. That silence, for Valians, was not empty but full of the things that were too precise for language. After a while, she said, in Velian, the word for trust is also the word for frequency. The idea is that trust is the resonance between 2 people, the matching hum that lets them hold each other up. Like resonance lifting, Cole said. Exactly like that, she said. Except it costs nothing. It is the one force in the universe that gets stronger the more you use it. Cole looked at the cluster that was Vel's star. He thought about his mother's toolbox, which he had retrieved from the bridge before it was cleared and which sat now in his locker at work, intact. He thought about Danny at her screen at 6 in the morning, finding the documents that changed everything. He thought about Myra sitting at a stall all day being a decoy with total serenity. He thought about Sarah, 9 years of looking the other way ending in a single sentence. He thought about Sol, alive. He thought about the particular note that a thing hums at when it is exactly what it is supposed to be. Zara, he said. Yes. Say it again. The word. She said it, a sound that was also a frequency, something that moved through the air between them and did not quite stop when it reached the edge of hearing. What does it feel like, he asked, when you say it? She turned to look at him, and her skin was that warm amber, deep and steady. Like holding something that holds you back, she said. The ventilation unit hummed. The stars turned their slow ancient turn. Somewhere far below, the lower district breathed and clanged and continued, in its noisy imperfect way, to hold itself up. And the smallest alien in Halcyon Station and the perpetually late mechanic who had finally stopped running stood on a roof above 60 floors of city and found the frequency between them. Unhurried, unspectacular, and completely, irrevocably real. Life lesson: the strongest things in any universe are also the quietest. Love, trust, and the willingness to stand for someone who cannot stand alone, these do not announce themselves loudly. They simply hold. And the holding, over time, becomes the whole shape of a life.